Resuming debate, the honourable member for Kildonan St. Paul.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. One man is dead and at least 7 people were injured in a rash of bloody attacks on the weekend as tensions reportedly escalate among drug dealers and gang members in a city already troubled by recent violence. At least 2 people were shot and 5 stabbed Friday evening to early Monday morning, in addition to a slaying Sunday at West Broadway apartment in Winnipeg. Winnipeg Police spokesperson Constable Danny McKinnon said Monday there have been 60 shootings so far this year. Tragically, a man named Austin Mark Chief, 24, later died in hospital. The death is being investigated as the city's 24th homicide of the year. Mitch Bourbonnier, a community social worker who we also had at Public Safety National Security Committee for our Guns and Gangs study, gave comment to the Winnipeg Free Press for the story, and he said that the violence, it's intensified, that meth and opioids and fentanyl and the poisonings have increased. It's really violent out there right now. He said, I've come to the conclusion that we are undeniably in a violent spike right now in our city. It's ongoing, but it's escalated. People are more desperate, more violent. There's more competition. It's more serious drugs on the streets. There's more guns. There's just more everything, he said. Drugs, gangs, and guns. Those 3 words, Madam Speaker. That was the top story for the Winnipeg Free Press just this morning. And just last week, there was yet another story, this is almost weekly now in Montreal, that the police are investigating 3 shootings in various areas of Montreal. Drive-by shootings have also increased in Montreal and cities like Toronto. Another story just a few weeks ago, June 6, 2022, or last week in Winnipeg, told the story about an adult female with her infant child was robbed and her car stolen in front of her at gunpoint. She was robbed at gunpoint with her infant child, Madam Speaker. These stories are becoming a weekly occurrence in Winnipeg, cities like Toronto, Montreal, Regina, Edmonton, Vancouver. So much so that I think the public is starting to get desensitized to the rising violent crime in our cities under the Liberal government's watch. It is fact that violent crime has increased steadily in the 7 years that they have been in power. It is fact that our streets are less safe under the so-called leadership of this Liberal government and this Minister of Justice. And so today we're debating 3rd reading of Bill C-5, which removes mandatory minimum sentencing for a number of serious crimes. And I'm just going to go through them for the House. So it removes mandatory prison time for firearm offenses, which in the recent discourse, I cannot wrap my head around how this government can claim it's getting tough on guns while Bill C-5 removes mandatory prison time for dangerous gun crimes. For example, robbery with firearm. The story that I just said, where a woman with her infant child in Winnipeg was robbed at gunpoint, her car stolen from her. No longer will that individual who terrorized that woman with her baby, no longer will that individual face mandatory prison time under Bill C-5. Shame. Also, extortion with a firearm, weapons trafficking, importing or exporting knowing it is unauthorized, discharging a firearm with the intent to injure. Madam Speaker, that is firing a gun at someone with the intention to hit them with the bullet. No longer mandatory prison time in Canada after Bill C-5 comes into place. Using firearm in a commission of an offense, possession of firearms knowing its possession is unauthorized. So if you're not allowed to have a firearm and you have one, you no longer have to face mandatory prison time. Meanwhile, we well know, the stats show, that the firearm violence in Canada is from those who are not legally allowed to possess a firearm. But under Bill C-5, no longer will those individuals who terrorize our communities, no longer will they absolutely be going to prison because of Bill C-5. Possession of a prohibited or restricted firearm with ammunition, possession of a weapon obtained by commission of an offense, possession for purpose of weapons trafficking, discharging a firearm recklessly. These are very serious gun violent crimes that will no longer, I will repeat, no longer face mandatory prison time because of Bill C-5. And I consistently hear from Liberal members that they're repealing these bad Conservative policies, but the fact is, many of these mandatory minimums were instituted by Liberal governments. And in fact, one of them in particular was instituted, that is the using firearm in a conviction of an offense, by Pierre Elliott Trudeau's government back in 1976. And they're actually keeping a number of mandatory minimum sentencing that Conservatives did bring in. So that argument doesn't stand. So to be clear, the Liberals are eliminating mandatory prison time for criminals who commit robbery with a firearm, weapons trafficking, and drive-by shootings. They make the argument that it's, well, I don't know, I guess soft on crime, let's go easy on criminals. They seem to be more interested in defending criminals than the victims they terrorize with guns. For example, they're expanding conditional sentencing, so they're allowing house arrest for the following crimes. Sexual assault. Sexual assault. So if someone sexually assaults someone, they could be serving house arrest in the neighborhood of the woman or the individual that they sexually assaulted. That will become more commonplace, more easily accessed by the courts, conditional sentencing, house arrest, and others, because of Bill C-5. Kidnapping, abduction of a person under 14, abducting a child, Madam Speaker, house arrest. Arson for fraudulent purposes, so setting fire to things, house arrest. Assault causing bodily harm or with a weapon, assaulting a peace officer causing bodily harm or with a weapon, trafficking in or importing Schedule III drugs. So talk a little bit more about the drug offenses as well, because this is really interesting. So they're also eliminating mandatory prison time for drug dealers. Last year, Madam Speaker, over 7,000 Canadians died as a result of opioid overdoses. That's things like fentanyl, carfentanil. Now, those addicted to drugs should be treated as a healthcare issue. Conservatives believe that someone addicted to drugs needs to be treated. We need to have more access. That's why in the last election we proposed building more treatment beds. That is very clear. But the individuals responsible for pushing deadly drugs on Canadians, killing 7,000 people last year, deserve to go to prison. Full stop. This bill eliminates mandatory prison time for trafficking or possession for the purpose of trafficking drugs. That's drug pushers, drug dealers. Importing or exporting or possession for the purpose of exporting. People who smuggle drugs into Canada, which kills thousands of Canadians, no longer mandatory prison time for them. Production or substance of Schedule I or II drugs like heroin, cocaine, fentanyl, crystal meth. People who create these drugs, who kill thousands of Canadians, particularly young people in BC and Ontario, no longer will face mandatory prison time as a result of Bill C-5. And this comes in light of the controversial decision in BC to decriminalize 2.5 grams of opioids and other hard drugs. So like carfentanil, for example, 2.5 grams, is capable of killing 1,250 people. 1,250 people. So what message do you think that decriminalizing at the same time that Bill C-5 is coming out? So at one side you're saying we're decriminalizing deadly drugs that killed 7,000 Canadians last year. And on the other side, we're saying no more mandatory prison time for the people responsible for making those drugs, smuggling those drugs, or trafficking those drugs and preying upon vulnerable Canadians. What kind of message is that sending? I think the drug dealers are just rubbing their hands at how much money they're going to make because of these actions. It's devastating for the families, and I know that there's different approaches of how to deal with the drug epidemic in Canada, but I firmly believe, as do Conservatives, that anyone responsible for dealing these dangerous drugs that kill thousands of Canadians deserves to go to prison. It's over 7,000 people. Opioids are more deadly to Canadians, to Canadian young people, than COVID was. That's how serious this drug epidemic is. And these Liberals are allowing those responsible for taking advantage of vulnerable Canadians off the hook, Madam Speaker. Unacceptable. Unacceptable to the 7,000 families who lost young people last year to opioid deaths. And this is all coming in light of violent crime stats going up significantly in Canada in the last 7 years. So, for example, across the country, police reported 743 homicides in 2020, which is the highest number of homicides recorded in Canada since 1991. There was also 56 more homicides in 2020 than in 2019, a hike that pushed Canada's rate up 7% to almost 2 homicides per every 100,000 people in Canada in 2020. That's up from the year prior. So again, we have violent crime increasing, this Liberal government bringing Bill C-5, which will allow individuals who use firearms in very dangerous crimes off the hook. There was also a recent Stats Canada report released just a few weeks ago that said since 2009, the per capita rate of firearms being pointed at someone in the commission of a crime tripled, and the rate at which guns are fired with intent to kill or wound is up 5-fold. And again, so these crimes are up, and again, as I said before, these crimes, firing a gun with the intent to injure someone, as I just mentioned, those statistics are up 5-fold. No longer will those individuals face mandatory prison time. And the Toronto Police Service has proposed a number of solutions. They said that the federal government should look at requiring bail hearings for people charged with the most serious firearm offenses to be heard by judges instead of by justice of the peace. It's a move the police said would clearly convey Parliament's view of the seriousness of this offenses. Again, the things we do in this place have important symbolism as well. The message we send to criminals and victims alike is very important. And I think I've outlined quite clearly the message that this Liberal government is sending criminals who endanger the lives of individuals, especially in our vulnerable communities. So the police are proposing bail reform. What's interesting about bail reform, and I've recently spoke to a number of police in southwestern or southern Ontario, and got their thoughts on bail reform. Because you may remember, Madam Speaker, a few years ago, in June 2019, Bill C-5, a Liberal bill, updated the bail provisions in Canada's criminal code for the first time since 1972. Now, there's varying opinions on this. Police will say some aspects were good, some aspects very bad. A story from last year quoted the Victoria Police Chief, Del Manick, who was asked why are violent, prolific, and repeat offenders being released from custody with little or nothing to prevent them from reoffending, right? We hear this from police all the time, the revolving door. Police put themselves in danger to catch criminals who are terrorizing neighborhoods. They put them in jail, but they're out the next week. The revolving door of essentially 100 to 200 offenders in cities, particularly in vulnerable neighborhoods, that are the cause of the vast majority of the violence. They catch and release them every week, putting their lives, their police lives, in danger to secure the safety of the vulnerable communities. They're just catching these guys over and over again. So I've asked police about this, and last year when the Victoria Police Chief was asked about this, and of course we know in Victoria, Vancouver, it is unbelievable to walk the streets in those cities and to see the crime that's going on. And so he said, the answer to that lies in recent extensive changes to the country's bail system that were intended, to address clogged courts and the overrepresentation of vulnerable populations. Okay? But the law makes clear, he said, that police are to give primary considerations to the release of the accused at the earliest opportunity and under the least onerous conditions. So I asked police about this. Now, this was a couple years ago, 2019, so bail reforms had a little bit of time to come into place. Many believe in the police forces that are the ones who see this more than anyone else in this House, that those bail reforms have furthered, quickened the catch and release policies that we've seen. So I bring this up to outline, we're seeing this rise in gun violence and violent crime in our cities. Many believe that it is tied to the bail reforms from a few years ago that are coming home to roost now. And now we have Bill C-5. Do we think it's going to get any better when we don't put violent criminals in jail for firing guns at people with the intent to injure them with a bullet, for robbing them at gunpoint, for pushing drugs on vulnerable Canadians and killing 7,000 people last year? What do we think is going to happen to the crime statistics when this comes in? Do we really think they're going to go down? I don't think so. Based on the recent policies of bail reform and the feedback I'm getting from frontline police officers, I'm going to guess that in a couple of years we're going to be seeing increased violence in our streets, less safe streets even than now, because of Bill C-5. And again, house arrest is very interesting. So someone fires a gun at someone, now they're not serving mandatory prison time, maybe they'll get house arrest. What does that mean? I wasn't even sure what house arrest meant. I kind of thought that meant, a police officer maybe stationed outside someone's house, a dangerous offender who shot a gun at someone, robbed someone at gunpoint, extorted them with a firearm. They must be watched. Not exactly. Not exactly. That individual is put in their home, in the community, often that they've terrorized, and in essence, left to their own devices. So can you imagine what's going to happen when a vulnerable community has been terrorized by a criminal with a gun, and rather than being removed from the situation to be put in prison to serve time for the crime that they've done to their community, they're now serving a sentence surrounded by the gang influences that led them to a life of crime. How do we think that that's going to work? And again, I have some comments from the members opposite over here. I would ask them to consider the sexual assault. I went through this already. But someone can sexually assault someone and then serve house arrest in the community of the individual they sexually assaulted. It's in their bill. It really doesn't make a lot of sense to me, Madam Speaker. And we heard in the speech prior to me, the press secretary for Justice, I believe, and again, I'm sure he was very sincere in his speech. I have a lot of respect for that member. But again, whenever he's pushed on this, whenever they're pushed on this, why are you going easy on criminals that use guns in dangerous crimes? Oh, but we're also increasing mandatory sentences for them. So the argument doesn't follow. We ask, why are you going easy on criminals with guns? They say, actually, we're increasing sentencing. That doesn't make sense. So you're saying you're increasing sentencing, but you're also letting them off the hook to serve house arrest in the communities that they have terrorized.
When was the last time?
They have terrorized. I just went over a situation where a woman was robbed at gunpoint with her child. Robbery with a firearm will no longer face mandatory prison time. That may be something members opposite are uncomfortable with, but that's in their bill. That individual who robbed that woman at gunpoint with her baby deserves to go to prison. No excuses. There's no way to see that otherwise. It is unbelievable that that individual that police did catch, that was charged with robbery with a firearm, was charged with violating his prohibition order to possess a firearm. He'd already been caught before and charged with something, released. Now he's terrorized the community again, robbed a woman with a baby at gunpoint. Now he'll likely be out again. I was recently actually in Grand Bend, a lovely community on Lake Huron with the member for Lambton Kent Middlesex. And I was speaking to police there on the ground, and they told me about what's happened as a result of Liberal soft on crime policies. So back to that gun reform, or bail reform, pardon me. An individual was stabbed to death outside the bar at 2 a.m. in this beautiful little tourist town. Stabbed to death. Very rare occurrence in this otherwise very safe, wonderful community. 2 weeks later, released on bail, went into a gas station, threatened the lives of 2 teenage girls behind at the cash. This man murdered murdered him with a knife, murdered an innocent man who was just outside the bar at the wrong time, murdered him out on the streets 2 weeks later, threatening the lives of 2 teenage girls. That's a result of bail reform, of what the Liberals have done with their soft on crime policies. If any Liberal would just take time to go talk to the police in their communities, they would hear the same things I'm hearing. It is unbelievable. It is as if parts of our communities are becoming lawless. You think of police, what do you think that feels for a police officer who has endangered their lives, run after these guys, the guy I just talked about who robbed a woman at gunpoint? What do you think that's like for them? Putting their lives on the line, he's back on the street 3 days later. What kind of incentive do they have to rush to the scene of the crime when it's the same guy they've been apprehending week over week? It's unbelievable, Madam Speaker. And I will just like to move a motion or move an amendment with my remaining time. I move, seconded by the member for Fort McMurray Cold Lake, that the motion be amended by deleting all the words after the word that and substituting the following. Bill C-5, an act to amend the Criminal Code and the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, be now read a third time, but be referred back to the Standing Committee on Justice and Human Rights for the purpose of reconsidering clauses 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, and 12 with a view to remove the provisions in the bill that would eliminate a number of mandatory minimum sentences for very serious crimes, namely robbery with a firearm, weapons trafficking and discharging a firearm with intent, possessions of a weapon obtained by commission of an offense, and possession for purpose of weapons trafficking. Madam Speaker, the purpose of this amendment is to take out the most insane parts of Bill C-5.
Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
I can't believe, Madam Speaker, that just before moving the amendment, the member actually said that police might choose not to do their job because of a policy that the government made. Thank God that the police forces throughout Canada don't operate the same way that conservative politicians do by picking and choosing when they think something is important enough to actually listen to the policies that have been created by this place. But nonetheless, Madam Speaker, you know, you would think by listening to the intervention there that individuals would not have to face any jail time whatsoever, and you don't even have to read between the lines. lines. The member said, and I quote, "This bill will, quote, let criminals off the hook," end quote. That is absolutely untrue. What this bill does is actually put the decision-making into the hands of the judges, the people who hear the case, the people that deliberate over it, and the people that render judgment at the end of the day. And I am certain that those judges will continue to render strict decisions when necessary.
The honourable member for Kildonan St. Paul.
Madam Speaker, I could tell that the member opposite is quite fired up about my speech, and good. He should be. He should be angry about his government bringing forward a bill that allows house arrest for those who rape other people. Sexual assault now could have house arrest, and he puts a lot of trust in judges. I respect our judges as well, but I don't always agree with them. For example, the Supreme Court recently said that if you are intoxicated, that could be a defense for rape. So judges don't always get it right, and the member opposite should remember that, Madam Speaker.
Questions et commentaires.
Questions and comments.
Comments. L'honorable.
The honourable member for Saanich-Sooke.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And I do take particular exception to the remarks by the previous member, which completely distort what's going on in C-5, and not only distort what's going on in C-5, but the position of the police in Canada on the bill. Both the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police and the National Police Federation, which represents RCMP officers, appeared in committee in support of this bill. What's going on here by the Conservatives is an attempt to distort the actual impacts of the bill and create some crisis in public safety when, in fact, the bill does exactly the opposite.
Member for Kildonan St. Paul.
I'm shocked that the member opposite would suggest that there isn't a crisis in public safety following years and years and years of soft on crime liberal policies. I talked extensively about that, and I guess we'll have to see. We'll have to see what happens to the crime stats after Bill C-5 comes. I hope I'm wrong. I hope I'm wrong. I hope there's not rapists serving house arrest next to the individuals that they raped, Madam Speaker. Based on the powers of this bill to give discretion to judges, I'm deeply concerned about individuals who brandish firearms around shooting them at people in their communities that now won't have to go to prison for it. So I will not apologize for standing up for vulnerable communities and the risk to them, first and foremost, that this bill presents, Madam Speaker.
The commentaire, l'honorable député.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Rivière-des-Mille-Îles. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to thank my colleague for her speech. We talked a lot about diversion as experienced in Portugal. There is a success. And also in Switzerland in the 90s, they adopted an approach called tough on drugs. This was a complete disaster. There were many issues as a result, and they put in place 4 measures. Treatment, reduction of harm, and the application of certain legislation. And this made a huge difference. In terms of diversion, I would like to hear my colleague talk about this kind of approach, and it's quite relevant.
Kildonan St. Paul.
Thank you to the member for his question. Again, I will reiterate that those suffering from drug addiction, that needs to be treated as a public health issue. That's why in the last election we ran on a policy to build more treatment beds for individuals suffering. Those who suffer from drug addiction should not be going to jail. They should be going into treatment. Unfortunately, we don't have nearly enough treatment beds in this country to help the thousands of Canadians who are addicted to dangerous and deadly drugs. But I will stand by our position that eliminating mandatory prison time for drug pushers, drug smugglers, those individuals are responsible for killing thousands of Canadians and should absolutely be behind bars, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments. The honourable member Sarnia Lambton.
Speaker. Earlier today, we heard one of the Liberal members talk about the high rate of reoffending. And so I fail to see how Bill C-5, if they let people out of jail early, is going to do anything to protect the public safety when people obviously are reoffending, which is what the Liberals said.
The honourable member Kildonan St. Paul.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Actually, I just got some information today that there are 378 repeat offenders recently arrested for committing other crimes that were also charged with 853 counts of breaching firearms prohibition orders. Again, often these communities, it is a small group of people that are catched and released, that are terrorizing these communities over and over and over again. Madam Speaker. These individuals are responsible for the death of people in vulnerable communities. They're responsible for firing firearms with the intent to injure individuals, robbing them at gunpoint, over and over and over again. The rap sheets of these criminals is getting longer and longer, and yet they are allowed to continue walking the streets, terrorizing vulnerable communities and Canadians at large. This is deeply concerning and needs to end, but the only way that's going to happen is if we can get these Liberal governments out of power, Madam Speaker.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary of the Government House Leader.
In response to my question, Madam Speaker, I couldn't believe what I heard. The member said, quote, "I respect judges, but they don't always get it right," end quote. That is just an example of the fundamental misunderstanding of the justice system and how it's supposed to be implemented. What the member should also be respecting are the decisions that the judges make, because that is a show that you genuinely understand and appreciate and respect the judicial system in Canada. But instead, what Conservatives are trying to do is basically, through that comment, they're trying to say that we are going to try to put a fail-safe in place for when, in their opinion, the judges don't get it right.
The Honourable Member for Kildonan St. Paul.
He believed the Supreme Court was correct in saying that intoxication for violent crime can be a defense for rape and homicide.
The Honourable Member for Shefford. Thank you, Madam Speaker. My colleague mentioned crimes against women, and that was studied a great deal during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. In Clause 32, the Liberal government in that case proposed that there would be specific circumstances when it came to crimes against Indigenous women. In cases like that, it was up to judges what sentence to apply. Does my colleague think that this has something to do with the solution? What does my colleague think?
Madam Speaker, I think the member opposite for her question, we've worked on together on committee. Thank her very much for her hard work. Actually, Winnipeg is the epicenter of murdered and missing Indigenous women. It's an extremely serious issue that is wreaking havoc on Winnipeg's North End in particular and our Northern Reserve communities. It is very serious. I know this issue very well, having worked for the provincial government at the time. And I would say that, again, we can go back to Bill C-5. It allows house arrest for sexual assault, for kidnapping. It allows no prison time for firing a gun with the intent to injure, for robbery with a firearm, extortion with a firearm. These are very serious offenses faced most of all by our most vulnerable in our societies. We see this time and time again, story after story, of Indigenous women and girls suffering at the hands of criminals doing these exact crimes that will no longer have mandatory prison time as a result of the Liberals' Bill C-5, Madam Speaker. It is unacceptable.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Winnipeg Centre.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for bringing up the genocide of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. I just want to point to the National Inquiry where specific calls for justice, call, in fact, for the end of mandatory minimum sentences because of the over-incarceration of Indigenous women, which includes 98% of women in prisons in Saskatoon or in Saskatchewan are Indigenous. So they actually call for a complete end of mandatory minimum sentences. And I'm wondering if my colleague actually does stand in solidarity with Indigenous women and will support this call for justice.
Member for Kildonan St. Paul's in 50 seconds.
I thank the member opposite for her question, and I applaud the work that she has done on this file. She's very, very knowledgeable, and I would not claim to know as much as she does about this important issue. I deeply respect her. But I would say that we will disagree on mandatory minimums, particularly when it comes to violence against Indigenous women with firearms. There are firearms offenses that are extraordinarily dangerous in this bill, and the individuals that are terrorizing vulnerable communities, including Indigenous women, may no longer face prison time and, in fact, may be serving house arrest in the communities of the women that they've terrorized. And I just could not in good conscience vote for a bill that would do that, Madam Speaker.